Hi, my name is Dave Nance, and I'd like us to look for a few minutes at the genealogy in the book of Matthew. Genealogies seem maybe just a little bit odd and boring. We don't keep track of genealogies very much anymore. Of course, in our modern time, we have many programs that are advertising about being able to trace your genetics DNA, but this is very, very different. This is, as you look at Matthew 1:1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. These genealogies that are many places in the Old Testament, of course, Matthew and Luke in the New Testament, they serve a very important purpose. They aren't just merely a list of names. The function that they serve is to tie Jesus, the Son of God, God who created everything, himself became a human being. Not just a human being in concept, not a human being in idea, not just a human being that you've heard of here or heard of there. This is Jesus who is tied very strongly, very firmly to a historical place and time with historical people, all of whom can be very much validated and analyzed. Now, if you don't think that's very important for us in our day and time, well, that's for you to judge. But it's tremendously interesting to me that the people who Jesus taught and their immediate disciples were willing to die for their faith in Jesus. They weren't willing to die for their faith in some mythological idea. They weren't willing to die for their faith in some cause or concept or campaign. They were willing to die for a particular human being who demonstrated himself to be the Son of the true God, creator of all reality. Now it begins with these genealogies that tie him to a particular time and place that people can know, people can check out, and verify. So the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ here in verse 1, the son of David, the son of Abraham. It's important to realize that the Jews did not use the word son or daughter in the same quite way that we do. We use it as a direct biological descent, father to son, father to daughter, mother to daughter, etc. And so the son is the exact first generation of the father. In the Hebrew world, that's not how they used these various words, son and daughter. They generally used them to indicate descent. Now, they were literal. They didn't mean that they were sideways and made up. No. But the grandfather or the great-grandfather and so on could just as easily be called the father of, and the great-grandson and the great-grandson could be called the son of. And so what you see here, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, who was 1,000 years older than Jesus or before Jesus, the son of Abraham, who was many, many generations before him. They're spoken of, Jesus is spoken of as their son in the sense that he is their direct linear descendant. Now you'll notice here in verse 1, there are some interesting lessons and concepts, and I won't go through every single one of these names. But it says, Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah and his brothers. So here you have the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah and his brothers were the beginning, the progenitors, the heads of their respective families within the one family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So now you go to verse 3. Judah begat Perez and Zerah by Tamar. One of the interesting things about the genealogies of Jesus, which is characteristic of the whole Bible, is that it does not gloss over and cover up sin. It doesn't pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't pretend that it wasn't there, that it wasn't what it was. Judah was a rather rebellious son of Jacob, quite frankly. Judah begat Perez and Zerah, twins, by Tamar. That begattal was a sin in many, many different ways. It was the sin of adultery, of course, or fornication, however you want to put it. But it was sinful in more ways than just that, if you look at the account in the book of Genesis. Yet, these two children, and actually particularly Perez, along with his mother Tamar, regardless of the sin of their begattal, of his begattal, they are included in the genealogy of Jesus because that is exactly the line of Jesus. You wouldn't expect, at least I wouldn't, that a genealogy over the generations would include only sinless people. Those people don't exist. And since no sinless people exist, then sometimes the sin is obvious, sometimes the sin is grievous, and sometimes the sin is less noticeable. Well, here Jesus is the descendant of these sinful people, this sinful relationship. That goes on similarly a little further down. A little further down, you will notice here that Perez begat Hezron, Hezron begat Ram, and in verse 4, Ram begat Amminadab, Amminadab begat Nahshon, Nahshon begat Salmon, and then verse 5, Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. We all remember who Rahab is. Rahab was the prostitute in the city of Jericho. And she was a idolater who came to faith in Jesus, and she set down the little line that allowed the spies of the kingdom of Israel to come in and find safe haven when they were being hunted. So she obviously came to faith. She was a pagan, not a Jew, and yet she is now included in the line of Jesus. So pagans are included in the line, sinners are included in the line. And the next, then you go, of course, Boaz begat Obed by Ruth. Ruth is another interesting person here. Ruth was not a Jew at all. She was a Moabitess. And as a Moabite, she was not allowed to worship in the temple. And so she is also included in the lineage of Jesus. Right here in the very beginning, you begin to get the idea that Jesus, although he came through the Jews in a line of descent, God seems to have gone out of his way to make it such that these people who are not pristine, perfect descendants of Abraham, they are included in this because Jesus is the Savior of all of us. Well, it goes a little further here. The same thing could be said in a similar way. David begat King Solomon of her who had been the wife of Uriah. Now, isn't that an interesting way to talk about something? Her who had been the wife of Uriah. You think about that for just a moment. Why would he use that strange way to identify Bathsheba? Well, I think the reason is because it emphasizes the illegitimacy of the relationship that David had with Bathsheba. It is never right, ever in any way, for a man to kill a woman and then marry his wife and then pretend that everything is just fine. Now, God did not let David off that hook, and yet, in spite of that very, very sinful situation, Solomon was anointed to be the descendant and the progenitor of our Savior. Now, of course, you go down through verses 8, 9, 10, and 11. As you go down through these descendants of David, you begin to notice that each of them begins to have more availability to modern archaeology. All of these are historical figures who lived in real times and in real places. And yet, as you get closer to the time of Jesus, the ability to nail down the exact historical location, time, and setting becomes more and more possible with the science of archaeology. And by the time you get to this in verse 11, where Josiah, Jeconiah, and his brothers, about the time they were carried along to Babylon, by this time there is a vast amount of archaeological information about all of these times, places, and people. So verse 12 carries on. They came to Babylon, and then he goes down through the names of the descendants, down through the time of Jesus. So again, what Matthew is doing is he is attaching very strong positive proof that the Son of God, Jesus, was not just a mythology. It wasn't just an idea that someone came somewhere in some way and did some fantastic things. These are all identifiable. These are all traceable. Now finally you get now down into verse 16. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who's called Christ. Now, notice he says Jesus, who is called Christ, and identifies him and his relationship with Joseph. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom is born Jesus. What's the point of that? Well, I think the point of that is really pretty obvious. Matthew is accounting the legal line of father-son generation down through all the way to the time of Jesus. The genealogy that traces Mary, actually Jesus' bloodline in a human sense, that's found in the book of Luke. The legal Jewish line of descent is established here in the book of Matthew. Now, You go on just a little bit further in verse 17, and this ends with an interesting thought. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And David until the captivity of Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon till the Christ are 14 generations. Now what I want you to notice here is that these 14 generations are memory devices that the early Jews used to remember these genealogies. You have to remember that the scriptures were written in a day and time when very few people could read. Most of the people had to have documents read to them. And so these important pieces of information like this would be memorized. And they would put in there what we call mnemonic devices or ways to aid your memory. And in this case, it is just so happened to be set up. I don't think it's just so happened, but it's set up so that there are 14 from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the captivity, and then 14 from the captivity to Jesus himself. A much needed way to remember all of these, particularly for people who didn't have the ability to read. I hope this strengthens your faith, it strengthens mine, and we'll talk to you a little bit later.